love the gospel of the Lord.
Heart to Heart, a Catholic media ministry, presents an inspiring gospel reflection by Father Michael Sparrow. Father Michael is a Jesuit priest working as a writer and retreat master at the Bellarmine Jesuit Retreat House outside Chicago.
The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Great crowds were traveling with Jesus, and he turned and addressed them, saying, "If anyone comes to me without hating his father and his mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. Which of you, wishing to construct a tower, does not first sit down and calculate the cost to see if there is enough for its completion? Otherwise, after laying the foundation and finding himself unable to finish the work, the onlookers should laugh at him and say, 'This one began something that he did not have the resources to finish.' Or what king, marching into battle, would not first sit down and decide whether with 10,000 troops he can successfully oppose another king advancing against him with 20,000 troops? But if not, while he is still far away, he will send a delegation to ask for peace terms. In the same way, every one of you who does not renounce all his possessions cannot be my disciple." The Gospel of the Lord. In today's Gospel, Jesus is advising us to calculate the cost of following him, to be prudent in terms of realizing what it is that we're undertaking. In one sense, I'm probably the least qualified person to be preaching about this, because I chronically underestimate how long things will take to get done, how much they will cost, and what kind of effort it'll be placed. Those that work with me know that I'm chronically running late and way overestimate what it can get done in any given day. But the adage is, preachers always preach the sermons that they need to hear, so know that I'm saying words that I need to hear, and I hope they're helpful for you. A key to today's gospel is it begins by St. Luke saying great crowds were traveling with Jesus. Why were great crowds traveling with Jesus? Because he was a healer, because he was an amazing storyteller, he was a fantastic preacher, he was a charismatic personality, and that excited the crowds. Perhaps their hopes were, well, maybe if I can get close enough and I will be healed. Or maybe they were just hanging on his every word, that there was a delight that came in their soul when they listened to him. And certainly in the back of their minds, or perhaps in the front of their minds, was the calculation, could this be the Messiah? And let's go with him to Jerusalem and be issued into glory, as we kick out the Romans and we finally take our place for what it means to be God's chosen people. Certainly, Jesus is suspect of these followers, which is why he delivers a very stern message. He uses two analogies, doesn't he? The first is about building a tower. And he assumes, and this is always where I get tripped up, he assumes that the people that are there know how to be prudent in terms of estimating what are the resources, how much is this going to cost, how much time is going to be involved in that. He assumes that you know this, right? And if you don't, and you start to build something that you can't finish, everybody's going to laugh at you and call you a fool. So you want to be prudent. The second analogy that he uses is a military one. If you're going into battle and you got 10,000 troops and you're opposed with 20,000, would you not calculate some kind of a ceasefire? I'm a Jesuit. We were founded by St. Ignatius Loyola. The beginnings of Ignatius's conversion, many of you know this story. He was a military commander. He was in charge of a garrison at Pamplona, right on the border between France and Spain. And he was defending part of the sub-kingdom, the kingdom of Navarre, part of the sub-kingdom of Spain. And they were horribly outnumbered by the French. There was no way that they were going to win that battle. But Ignatius was all about his reputation. And so he whipped the guys into a fervor and say, whoa, how glorious it will be if we die for the crown. And our names will be remembered forever, and the maidens will be singing songs about us. Well, anyone with an ounce of brains would have negotiated a settlement, but not when you're trying to win eternal glory on the lips of the young maidens. And so he whipped his soldiers under his command to fight until a cannonball came over the rampart and broke both of his legs. And then that was like the wake-up call that everybody said, let's get the heck out of here. Let's surrender and do what we should have done days ago. Jesus uses that analogy. Be prudent in war. Be prudent in your economic enterprises. Don't you know how to do that? And then he flips the tables around and he said, why do you think it's going to be easy if you're following me? And then he uses Semitic hyperbole for dramatic effect. Unless anyone is willing to hate their father or their mother or their kids or their very life, they can't be my follower. Translation, God first, everything else second. And of course, what Jesus is speaking about has to be interpreted in the context of our first reading from Paul's letter to the Romans, that he said the whole law is summarized in love. If you're loving, then you're fulfilling the law. And what are the great commandments? Love God first, love your neighbor as yourself. But God has to come first. If God doesn't come first, the whole thing comes tumbling down. It doesn't make any sense. Let me give you two examples. I was talking to a young woman some time ago who had had an abortion, and I was praying for her as I'm a Project Rachel priest, praying for women and men who have been involved in abortions, praying for their healing. I've never met anyone who has had an abortion who hasn't, at least years later, sometimes immediately, but years later, regretted it deeply. And this young woman was so deeply ashamed of what she had done. And I asked her to talk about that and why she did it. And she said, my boyfriend was everything to me. He pressured me to have sex. He pressured me to have the abortion. I compromised my values because I put him first. That's one example of what Jesus is talking about. God has to come first. Doing what we know is right has to come first. Second example. I heard Sister Helen Prejean speak Monday night at Dominican University as part of their lecture series. You may remember her as the author of the book Dead Man Walking. There's an opera that is showing now. It opened this past weekend at the Lyric Opera, and she was in town for the opening of that opera. It tells the story of her befriending a death row inmate and then walking to him in his final execution. Not only walking with him, but also walking with the family of the one he had killed, brutally murdered. Sister Helen walking with both the murderer and the survivors of the one who had been murdered. And she told the story. She's a strong advocate against the death penalty. And she met personally with Pope John Paul, and she met personally with Pope Francis. And if you followed it, you know that the Catechism of the Catholic Church has been gradually strengthening in terms of taking a very strong stand against the death penalty. And she said she's also been investigating wrongful convictions of those on death row, those who have been convicted. And if you begin to look at the statistics, you see that by far, those who are condemned to die are the poor and racial minorities. If you got enough money to get a good lawyer, you don't end up on death row. It's not the crime, it's how much money you have to pay the lawyer to be able to get you out of a death conviction. Well, in studying this, what Sister Helen discovered and those that she was working with, of the wrongful convictions of the hundreds of those who were condemned to die on death row, when they investigated the case, in almost every instance, there was suppression of evidence by the prosecuting attorneys. In other words, those who were attempting to convict a person in a murder case, those attorneys, even though they had facts that would exonerate the one who was accused, they suppressed that evidence because they would lose the case. What was more important was winning the case than doing what was just. I've heard the confessions of many attorneys, and I'm delighted that their conscience has been pricked, and to be honest, in the context of the confession. But I've heard personally of similar cases of bilking up or fattening the hours that have to be calculated. And I'm not picking on attorneys. I'm just using that as one example of what Jesus is talking about here today. Of what comes first. For many of us, it's family first and then God. For many of us, it's our career first. And if we get seduced by the so-called prosperity gospel, then we get seduced into thinking that if I follow the gospel and I go to church and I give a few bucks to the church and I say a few novenas, some rosaries, light some candles, God is going to bless me and my life will be on easy street. I'm going to be healthy. I'm going to be wealthy. I'm going to be wise. And Jesus says, folks, it doesn't work that way. Jesus points to the crucifix and he says, calculate the cost. Pick up your cross and follow me. I'm heading to Jerusalem. I'm going to get crucified. How about you? Are you willing to stand with me then? Most of us have a naive understanding of what the gospel is about. We turn our religion into magic. You do this for me, Jesus. I do this for you, Jesus. And then you do this for me. I say these prayers. I give this money, I give these good deeds, and then you give me this and this and this, exactly what I want. Jesus says, sorry, it doesn't work that way. You do these prayers, you do these good deeds, and your heart will be transformed to be able to say yes to whatever the Father asks. That's the hard truth. That's the sobering reality. There are many preachers that don't preach that aspect of the gospel. That's why I say today's gospel is particularly sobering. It's challenging. It's one of those, thanks, I needed that wake up. What's the reality? Who is this Christ that we're following? And when we look at that, I think each of us are going to say, Jesus, I can't do it. I don't have that kind of strength. And I think when we pray that prayer, there's a smile that comes on Jesus' face. And he says, you're right, you can't, but I can. Let me be Emmanuel for you. Let me be your strength. Let me be your grace. Every day, ask me, come into my heart, Jesus. Guide my actions, guide my thoughts. Give me the strength that I don't have of myself. In story after story after story of those who are called to do great things, they stand before the Lord, whether it's Moses, whether it's Isaiah, whether it's Jeremiah, whether it's Mary, whether it's Peter, whether it's St. Paul. They stand before the Lord and they say, I can't do that. And God's answer is always the same. I will be with you. When we acknowledge our own weakness, then we open the door of our hearts to God's grace to flood in. My favorite name for Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. But we have to ask. We have to acknowledge our own weakness. And when we do, that's the prayer of power. It's not a power that comes from our own strength. It's not a power that comes from our own ego or our own wisdom or our own material possessions. It's a power that comes from saying, Lord, you are my strength. Let me rely on you. Amen?
Heart to heart, hand in hand, praying for grace to understand. Spirit of Jesus, open our hearts to live and to love the gospel